In 1945, the deadliest war in human history finally came to an end. Cities stopped burning. Soldiers laid down their weapons. Families waited for loved ones to return home. Across the world, millions of men began the long journey back to the lives they had left behind. But one soldier never came back. Not because he was killed. Not because he was captured. And not because he was forgotten. Deep inside a remote jungle in the Philippines, a young Japanese intelligence officer continued fighting a war that had already ended. Days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. While the world entered the age of television, jet travel, computers, and even moon landings, he remained hidden beneath the trees, carrying the same rifle, following the same orders, and believing that surrender was impossible. For 29 years, he survived in complete isolation from modern civilization. And when he finally emerged from the jungle, the world he returned to barely resembled the one he had left behind. This is the extraordinary true story of the soldier who refused to surrender for 29 years, even after the war ended. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to travel back to a very different world. A world consumed by war. A world where loyalty was considered more important than life itself. And a world where a single military order could shape the destiny of a man for the next 3 decades. The soldier's name was Hiro Onoda. Born in Japan in 1922, he grew up during a period when military service was viewed as one of the highest forms of honor. From an early age, he learned discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. Like many young men of his generation, he watched his country become increasingly involved in a conflict that would eventually engulf much of the world. By the time he entered military service, the Second World War was reaching a critical stage. Japan was losing territory. Allied forces were advancing across the Pacific. Resources were running low, and military leaders were desperately searching for ways to slow the enemy's progress. Unlike ordinary infantry soldiers, Onoda received specialized training in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. He was taught how to gather information, sabotage enemy operations, survive in hostile environments, and continue fighting even when completely cut off from support. Those lessons would soon become the foundation of one of the most unbelievable survival stories in modern history. In late 1944, Onoda received orders that would change his life forever. He was assigned to Lubang Island in the Philippines. Before leaving, his commanding officer gave him instructions that he would never forget. Instructions he would follow far longer than anyone could have imagined. When Hiro Onoda arrived on Lubang Island in December of 1944, the war was already turning against Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific with overwhelming strength. One island after another was falling. Military commanders knew that many of the remote positions scattered throughout the region would eventually become isolated and cut off from reinforcements. Lubang was a small island in the Philippines, covered by dense forests, steep hills, and rugged terrain. To most people, it seemed insignificant. But in wartime, even the smallest islands could become strategic locations. Onoda was only 22 years old. Like many young officers, he carried a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. He had completed his intelligence training and believed he was prepared for whatever awaited him. Yet nothing in his education could have prepared him for what would happen over the next 29 years. Shortly before his departure, he met with Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who would unknowingly shape the rest of his life. The instructions were clear, direct, and unlike anything given to ordinary soldiers. He was told to conduct guerrilla operations. He was told to gather intelligence. He was told to resist enemy forces for as long as possible. And most importantly, he was told something that became permanently engraved in his mind. Under no circumstances was he to surrender. Under no circumstances was he to take his own life. No matter what happened. No matter how long it took. Help would eventually come. For most soldiers, such words would have been understood as wartime motivation. A command designed to strengthen morale during difficult circumstances. For Onoda, they became an absolute mission. A promise. A responsibility that could never be abandoned. When he reached Lubang Island, however, reality immediately proved more complicated than he expected. Local Japanese commanders were not interested in his plans for guerrilla resistance. Some dismissed his recommendations. Others believed the situation was already hopeless. As Allied forces approached, confusion spread across the island. Communication became increasingly difficult. Supplies were limited. The possibility of defeat no longer seemed distant. It seemed inevitable. Then, in February 1945, American and Filipino troops landed on Lubang. The invasion unfolded quickly. Japanese defenses collapsed. Many soldiers were killed. Others surrendered. Some disappeared into the jungle. Among those who vanished into the forests was Hiro Onoda. He was not alone at first. 3 other Japanese soldiers joined him. Together they carried rifles, ammunition, basic supplies, and a shared determination to avoid capture at all costs. From the safety of the jungle canopy, they watched the island change around them. The war continued. Or at least, they believed it did. As weeks passed, they survived by moving constantly through the dense terrain. They slept in hidden locations. They avoided roads and villages. They learned where to find water and how to locate food. Every decision was made with survival in mind. Then something unexpected happened. The war ended. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered. Across the world, celebrations erupted. Families embraced. Prisoners returned home. Entire nations began rebuilding their futures. But deep within the jungles of Lubang Island, Onoda and his companions knew nothing about it. No radio message reached them. No commanding officer arrived. No official order was delivered. And when the first signs finally appeared, they refused to believe them. One morning, they discovered leaflets scattered across the jungle. The papers claimed that Japan had surrendered. The fighting was over. The soldiers should come out of hiding. To most people, the message seemed obvious. To Onoda, it looked like enemy propaganda. The Americans wanted them to surrender. Of course they would print leaflets. Of course they would try to deceive isolated soldiers. Everything he had learned during intelligence training told him to distrust information provided by the enemy. And so he did. The leaflets were ignored. The war, in his mind, continued. What he could not possibly know was that this single decision would trap him in a different era for nearly 3 decades. The months following Japan's surrender became a strange and dangerous existence. For Hiro Onoda and the 3 men hiding beside him, every day began with the same assumption. The war was still being fought. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese forces were regrouping. Somewhere beyond the ocean, commanders were planning their return. And until that day arrived, their duty remained unchanged. The jungle became their entire world. The towering trees formed a ceiling above them. Thick vegetation concealed their movements. Hidden trails connected temporary camps that could be abandoned at a moment's notice. At first, survival was difficult. Food supplies disappeared quickly. The small amount of equipment they had carried into the forest began to wear out. Yet surrender was never seriously discussed. Instead, they adapted. They learned which fruits could be eaten safely. They collected coconuts. They searched for edible plants. Occasionally they slaughtered cattle from nearby farms, believing they were taking necessary resources from territory occupied by the enemy. At night, they often watched distant lights from villages below. Those lights fascinated them. The island appeared peaceful. Too peaceful. To Onoda, that calm only reinforced his suspicions. He believed the enemy was trying to create an illusion of normal life. A trap designed to lure hidden soldiers from the jungle. The longer he remained hidden, the more deeply that belief became rooted. Years passed. Leaflets continued to appear. Newspapers were left behind. Messages were dropped from aircraft. Some even contained photographs and information that seemed impossible to fake. The documents described post-war Japan. They spoke of reconstruction. They spoke of economic recovery. They spoke of a nation trying to move beyond the devastation of war. Yet every piece of evidence only generated new doubts. If the enemy wanted Japanese soldiers to surrender, what better strategy could there be than creating convincing stories? To Onoda, the information seemed almost too perfect. Too carefully designed. Too convenient. His intelligence training had taught him to question everything. Now that training was working against him. As the years turned into a decade, the small group began to change. Constant isolation affects the human mind in ways few people can imagine. Every sound becomes suspicious. Every unexpected event feels threatening. Every stranger becomes a potential enemy. The four soldiers depended entirely on one another, but even strong bonds can weaken under endless pressure. In 1949, one of the men, Yuichi Akatsu, quietly slipped away. Without informing the others, he left the jungle. For months, nobody knew what had happened to him. Had he been captured? Had he died? Had he betrayed them? The uncertainty lingered. Then, months later, leaflets appeared announcing that Akatsu was alive. According to the messages, he had surrendered and returned to society. The announcement was intended to reassure the remaining soldiers. Instead, it had the opposite effect. If Akatsu had truly surrendered, why was the enemy publicizing it so aggressively? To Onoda, it looked like another psychological operation. Another attempt to weaken their resolve. The distrust deepened. The jungle grew quieter. 3 men remained. Years continued to pass. By the 1950s, an entire generation of children was growing up in post-war Japan. New businesses were opening. New cities were being built. Television sets were appearing in homes. The world was changing rapidly. Meanwhile, hidden beneath the forests of Lubang Island, 3 soldiers still carried rifles and prepared for battles that no longer existed. Then tragedy struck again. In 1954, one of Onoda's companions, Corporal Shuichi Shimada, was killed during an encounter with local authorities. For nearly a decade he had survived the hardships of jungle life. Then, in a matter of moments, he was gone. Now only 2 men remained. 2 aging soldiers trapped inside a mission that the rest of the world had abandoned years earlier. Yet neither considered surrender. Neither questioned the purpose of what they were doing. Because every sacrifice seemed to confirm the importance of their duty. The more years they invested, the harder it became to accept the possibility that they had been wrong from the beginning. And so they continued. Through storms. Through hunger. Through illness. Through endless isolation. Completely unaware that the modern world was racing forward without them. By the early 1960s, humanity was preparing to enter space. But Hiro Onoda was still sleeping beneath jungle trees, waiting for orders that would never come. By the beginning of the 1960s, Hiro Onoda had already spent more than 15 years hiding in the jungles of Lubang Island. 15 years. Long enough for a child to become an adult. Long enough for entire governments to rise and fall. Long enough for the world to transform itself beyond recognition. Yet Onoda remained trapped in the same routine. Wake before sunrise. Observe the surroundings. Move carefully through the jungle. Avoid detection. Stay prepared for combat. The mission, as far as he was concerned, had never changed. Only one companion remained by his side now. His name was Kinshichi Kozuka. Together, the 2 men had become shadows moving through the forests. The jungle had shaped them. Their uniforms had been repaired countless times using whatever materials they could find. Their equipment was old. Their weapons were aging. Their faces were weathered by years of exposure to rain, heat, and uncertainty. But despite everything, they were still alive. And perhaps most surprisingly, they still believed that Japan's military command would eventually return for them. Occasionally they observed villagers working in fields below the mountains. The island appeared peaceful. Prosperous, even. Yet Onoda interpreted these observations through the lens of war. He convinced himself that what he was seeing was part of a larger deception. The enemy wanted hidden soldiers to believe the conflict was over. The enemy wanted them to lower their guard. The enemy wanted them to surrender. Every peaceful scene became evidence supporting his suspicions rather than challenging them. It is one of the most remarkable aspects of human psychology. When a belief becomes deeply embedded, people often interpret new information in ways that strengthen the belief instead of questioning it. The more evidence appeared that the war had ended, the more determined Onoda became to distrust that evidence. Over time, his world narrowed. Not physically. Mentally. The jungle became reality. Everything outside the jungle became uncertain. Everything beyond his direct experience became questionable. And so he continued waiting. Waiting for ships. Waiting for aircraft. Waiting for Japanese troops. Waiting for orders. Waiting for a war that had ended before many of the island's younger residents had even been born. Then, in 1972, another devastating blow arrived. One that would leave Onoda completely alone. For years, Kozuka had remained loyal to the mission. The two men survived together through storms, shortages, and endless isolation. Their shared belief created a bond that few people could ever understand. But on October 19, 1972, that bond was shattered. Kozuka was killed during an encounter with local authorities. After nearly 3 decades in hiding, Onoda suddenly found himself alone. Completely alone. No companions. No conversations. No witnesses. Just the jungle. The silence that followed must have been overwhelming. For 27 years he had lived alongside other soldiers. Now there was nobody. The last remaining link to his wartime world had disappeared. Most people would have surrendered. Most people would have accepted reality. Most people would have walked out of the forest and asked for help. But Hiro Onoda was not most people. Instead, he continued. Alone. At this point, he was no longer simply following military orders. The mission had become part of his identity. Without it, who was he? Without it, what had the previous 27 years meant? Accepting that the war had ended decades earlier would require confronting an unimaginable possibility. That he had sacrificed nearly his entire adult life for a misunderstanding. That possibility was more painful than the hardships of the jungle. And so he remained hidden. One man. One rifle. One mission. One belief. While Onoda wandered through the forests of Lubang Island, the rest of humanity was entering a completely different era. Televisions broadcast live events around the world. Commercial jets crossed oceans in hours. The first humans had walked on the moon. Computers were beginning to appear in offices. Entire generations had grown up without any memory of the Second World War. Yet none of that reached him. To Onoda, it might as well have been another planet. Then, unexpectedly, fate intervened. Not through an army. Not through a government. Not through military command. But through a young traveler who refused to believe that the legendary holdout soldier was merely a myth. A traveler whose determination would finally bring the world's longest war mission to an end. In early 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki made a decision that most people considered ridiculous. He wanted to find Hiro Onoda. By that point, Onoda had become something between a legend and a mystery. Reports suggested that he was still alive somewhere on Lubang Island, but few people truly believed it. After all, nearly 30 years had passed since the end of the war. How could anyone survive that long in isolation? How could anyone continue believing that the conflict was still being fought? Yet Suzuki was convinced. Unlike military officials and search teams who had failed repeatedly over the years, he approached the challenge with a simple idea. If Onoda was still alive, perhaps he wasn't hiding from everyone. Perhaps he was hiding only from people he considered enemies. So Suzuki traveled to the Philippines alone. No military escort. No government operation. No elaborate strategy. just a backpack, determination, and an extraordinary sense of curiosity. He entered the forests of Lubang Island and began searching. The jungle remained vast and unforgiving. Days passed. Then something remarkable happened. He found him. Or more accurately, Onoda allowed himself to be found. Imagine the scene. A young traveler born after the war was standing face to face with a soldier who still believed the war had never ended. Two Japanese men. Separated by an entire era. One representing the modern world. The other representing a world that had disappeared decades earlier. Suzuki later described the encounter as calm and respectful. Onoda did not immediately trust him. But he listened. Suzuki explained that Japan had changed. The war was over. The world had moved on. Families had searched for him. People back home knew his name. They wanted him to return. Yet Onoda remained unconvinced. The same problem that had defeated countless previous attempts remained. Proof. How could he know that this was not another deception? How could he know that the information was real? For nearly 30 years, he had survived precisely because he questioned everything. Abandoning that mindset overnight was impossible. Then Onoda revealed something important. There was only one person from whom he would accept orders. The commanding officer who had sent him to Lubang Island in 1944. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. If Taniguchi personally appeared and officially relieved him of duty, he would surrender. If not, he would continue his mission. Most people would have considered the demand impossible. Nearly 3 decades had passed. The war was ancient history. The officer was no longer an active military commander. But Japan decided to try. The search began. Eventually, Taniguchi was located. He was no longer serving in the military. Like millions of others, he had built an entirely different life after the war. Yet now he was being asked to return to the Philippines and complete a mission that should have ended in 1945. In March of 1974, the former major traveled to Lubang Island. For the first time in almost 30 years, commander and soldier stood before one another again. The moment was surreal. The young officer who had once received orders was now a 52-year-old man. The war that had defined his entire adult life had been over for decades. The empire he had served no longer existed in the form he remembered. The world itself had transformed. And finally, the words he had been waiting to hear arrived. His commander officially relieved him of duty. The mission was over. The war was over. The waiting was over. The order was real. For Hiro Onoda, everything changed in that moment. Nearly 3 decades of certainty suddenly collided with reality. The conflict he had dedicated his life to had ended long ago. The reinforcements he expected were never coming. The world he remembered existed only in memory. Shortly afterward, Onoda emerged from the jungle wearing his uniform, carrying his rifle, and stepping into a future that felt almost unimaginable. Photographs from that period are astonishing. The uniform is worn. The equipment is old. Yet he stands there as if time itself had paused around him. While the world had raced forward, he had remained frozen in a single mission. And now, for the first time since 1944, he was finally going home. But returning home would prove far more difficult than surviving the jungle itself. When Hiro Onoda stepped off the airplane in Japan, he entered a country he barely recognized. The nation he had left behind in 1944 no longer existed. In its place stood one of the most rapidly transformed societies in modern history. The streets were different. The cities were different. The technology was different. Even the people seemed different. For nearly 30 years, Onoda had lived according to the values and assumptions of wartime Japan. Now he was suddenly surrounded by a world that had moved on without him. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. Newspapers covered every detail of his return. Television crews followed his movements. Millions of people were fascinated by the man who had vanished into history and somehow returned alive. To many, he was a symbol of loyalty and perseverance. To others, he was a tragic reminder of the human cost of war. Some admired his dedication. Others questioned whether such dedication had gone too far. But regardless of opinion, almost everyone agreed on one thing. His story was extraordinary. The adjustment was not easy. Imagine leaving home as a young man and returning nearly 3 decades later to discover that the entire world had changed. Friends were older. Family members had aged. Some people he once knew were gone forever. The culture around him felt unfamiliar. The pace of modern life seemed overwhelming. Television broadcasts, modern transportation, electronic devices, and social changes had transformed everyday existence. Many returning veterans struggle after a few years away. Onoda faced a gap of nearly 30 years. The psychological challenge was immense. Yet perhaps the most difficult burden was not adapting to technology. It was confronting time itself. Every birthday he had missed. Every opportunity he had lost. Every ordinary experience that had passed him by while he waited in the jungle. For most people, life unfolds gradually. Changes happen slowly enough to process. For Onoda, 3 decades of change arrived almost at once. It was like waking from a very long dream. A dream that had lasted most of his adult life. Despite the challenges, he attempted to build a new future. He wrote about his experiences. He gave interviews. He reflected on the choices he had made and the beliefs that had sustained him. His story attracted attention far beyond Japan. Around the world, people became fascinated by the question at the center of his life. How could someone remain committed to a mission for so long? The answer is more complex than many assume. It is easy to look back and wonder why he did not simply surrender. Why he did not trust the leaflets. Why he ignored the evidence. But human beings are shaped by the environments in which they live. By the values they are taught. By the promises they make. By the identities they build. For Onoda, surrender was not simply an action. It represented the destruction of everything he believed he was. The longer he remained in the jungle, the more difficult it became to abandon that identity. In many ways, his story reveals something universal about human nature. Not because most people will spend decades hiding in a jungle, but because all of us hold beliefs that shape how we interpret reality. Sometimes those beliefs help us survive. Sometimes they help us persevere through hardship. And sometimes they prevent us from seeing that the world has already changed. Years later, Onoda eventually settled for a period in Brazil, where he worked and built a quieter life away from the intense attention that followed his return. Eventually he would return to Japan again, carrying with him memories that no one else could truly understand. He had witnessed a version of history that existed nowhere else. A private war fought long after the rest of the world had found peace. Yet even today, decades after his death, people continue to ask the same question. Was Hiro Onoda a hero? A victim? A symbol of loyalty? Or a warning about the dangers of believing too strongly in a single idea? Perhaps the answer is all of those things at once. Because the story of Hiro Onoda is not simply about war. It is about conviction. It is about identity. It is about the extraordinary lengths a person can go to remain faithful to a promise. And it is about what happens when time moves forward, while one man refuses to move with it. There are stories that disappear with time. Stories that fade as generations pass. Stories that become little more than footnotes in history books. But Hiro Onoda's story endured. Not because it was the largest story of the Second World War. Not because it changed the outcome of history. But because it forces us to confront questions that remain relevant in every generation. Questions about duty. Questions about belief. Questions about the extraordinary power of the human mind. After returning to civilian life, Onoda spent many years reflecting on the path that had brought him back from the jungle. The world often tried to reduce his experience to a simple explanation. Some called him stubborn. Others called him loyal. Some viewed him as a relic of a vanished era. Others saw him as a symbol of unwavering commitment. Yet none of those descriptions fully capture what happened. Because the truth is far more human. For nearly 30 years, Onoda woke up every morning with purpose. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he believed. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. In a strange way, certainty became his shelter. The jungle provided food, water, and concealment. But certainty gave him something even more important. Meaning. That meaning allowed him to endure isolation that would have broken many others. It allowed him to survive hardships that seemed impossible. It allowed him to continue when logic suggested he should stop. Yet the same certainty that helped him survive also prevented him from seeing reality. And perhaps that is why his story remains so powerful. Because it reflects a struggle that exists far beyond the battlefield. Every generation creates its own versions of the jungle. Not always physical jungles. Sometimes they are emotional. Sometimes they are ideological. Sometimes they are built from fear, pride, tradition, or old wounds. People spend years holding on to beliefs that once protected them. Beliefs that once served a purpose. Beliefs that once helped them survive difficult times. Yet life changes. Circumstances change. The world changes. And occasionally, the hardest thing a person can do is recognize that an old mission has already ended. That a battle is already over. That the war they continue fighting exists only in memory. When Hiro Onoda finally stepped out of the jungle in 1974, he carried more than a rifle. He carried nearly 3 decades of sacrifice. 3 decades of discipline. 3 decades of loneliness. 3 decades of faith. The world saw a soldier. But beneath the uniform stood a man who had sacrificed almost an entire lifetime to a promise. A promise he never abandoned. Whether people view that devotion as inspiring or tragic remains a matter of perspective. Perhaps that is why historians, writers, and ordinary readers continue discussing his life decades later. His story refuses to fit neatly into a single category. It is a survival story. A war story. A psychological story. A human story. And maybe that is exactly why it continues to resonate. Because beneath the extraordinary circumstances lies something familiar. The desire to remain true to ourselves. The fear of being wrong. The comfort of certainty. And the challenge of accepting change. When Hiro Onoda entered the jungle, Franklin Roosevelt was still alive. The atomic bomb had not yet been used. Television was rare. The internet did not exist. Human beings had never traveled into space. When he finally emerged, the world had already witnessed moon landings, global television broadcasts, jet travel, and technological revolutions. Few people in history have experienced such an extreme separation from the passage of time. Yet perhaps the most remarkable fact is not how long he remained hidden. It is that he survived long enough to tell the story. Today, the forests of Luban Island remain quiet. The war is long over. The soldiers are gone. The gunfire has faded into history. But somewhere between those trees and the memories they still hold lives one of the most extraordinary true stories ever recorded. The story of a young soldier who received an order. The story of a man who never forgot it. And the story of how one of the deadliest wars in history continued for 29 years in the mind of a single human being. If this story taught us anything, it is that history is not only made by famous leaders and great battles. Sometimes history is hidden in the choices of one person. One belief. One promise. And one decision that changes an entire lifetime. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most remarkable untold stories of the 20th century. And if you enjoy discovering the forgotten people, lost events, and extraordinary lives that history nearly left behind, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next story. Because history still holds countless secrets waiting to be remembered.